Hey everyone. So myself Raju Dandigam. So today I would like to talk about Cypress component testing and Storybook together, how it can drastically improve the testing workflow, especially as the applications grow large and component heavy. So today modern web apps often have like hundreds of interactive components. So testing them purely end to end is slow, flaky, and sometimes misses the edge cases that only occur within a single component. So in that case, component testing helps us to isolate and validate those pieces. So let's quickly look at the agenda and then we'll see what are the topics we're going to touch and then how we're going to basically navigate through this session. So first we'll look at why component testing matters, and then we'll look into it like how we'll basically do the Cypress component testing and how it brings the real browser fidelity and faster feedback. And then we'll also look into the storybook and then how the storybook is going to work together with Cypress, and then how we're going to use compose stories to connect those both those worlds. And then we'll also look into the flight search demo, which is basically have a small project, which basically have a couple of pages where we can actually make use of component testing and end-to-end testing, and then see how these things come together. So the goal is to exactly know how to set up the project and understand why it scales better than the traditional testing workflows. So let's start with the component testing. So why component testing? So the first, before we'll understand what it is. So component testing meaning like we rendering a single UI component in isolation in a real browser, not just in a like simulated DOM. So where we can verify its behavior, styling, accessibility without needing the entire app to run. So this gives us a faster feedback cycle compared to the end-to-end test. The test runs in faster than the end-to-end test. And it has the higher fidelity than the unit test because we are not mocking the browser, and then we are actually testing it in the actual browser. And the failures are the isolated, and then we can be reliable on them. So when something breaks, we know exactly which component caused it. And most importantly, it supports a shift left testing approach where developer find bugs earlier in the cycle. So right as they code. Also, it is the bridge between the fast unit test and full end-to-end test validation. So where does this fit into the testing strategy? So if you visualize the testing pyramid, so we'll have the unit test at the bottom, and then we may have integration test, and then we'll have end-to-end test. So the component test sits right just above the unit test, where where it makes sure the components behave correctly before wiring them together into the complete end-to-end test. Whereas the unit test makes sure the verifying the logic and pure functions. So this component testing is something sits in the middle, and then it basically works as a bridge to balance the entire testing strategy. So this also keeps us testing fast, reliable, and maintainable as the system grows. Now, let's talk about the Cypress component testing. So, what makes Cypress different than the unit test or like the other component testing is basically it runs in a real browser, and then the rendering behavior and the what component we are going to render is actually what users is going to see, and it uses the same Cypress command which we already familiar with the Cypress end-to-end testing. Also, it also supports the all other great features like time traveling, and then it allows you to time traveling debugging, and it allows you to do the hard module replacement and all the features related to the debugging and all the end-to-end features, right? So it uses the same infrastructure. So so that's all about the Cypress. But then, what is the Storybook, and then how this basically gonna work together with the Cypress? So Storybook is one of the most popular tools for UI development. It is mainly used as a living documentation for the design system to actually see how the component looks and how it actually visually looks, and what are the each of these states we're gonna have possibly, right? So potentially, what are the possible states, and what are the error state, what are the possible variations of a component. So all together, all those things can be seen in a storybook, and it basically runs in a sandboxed environment generally. Also, each story is a use case written in a component story format, so which is basically a standard JavaScript module pattern that describes how the component should render. So the component story format is basically is going to help us to connect these connect these Storybook and Cypress. So the Storybook also bridges the teams like designers, engineers, and QAs, where all can share a common visual source of truth. And when we start combine the Cypress with the Storybook, so the visual source of truth, which is Storybook, can turn into a testable source of truth. So we can basically test the those visual source of truth, then it can become a testable source of truth, right? So how that magic happens? So let's see it. So how can we combine the Cypress and Storybook together, and then what it gonna add us, like what it gonna give us? So the way we're gonna do is basically we're gonna use the same stories as the test fixtures, and then as the test fixtures for the Cypress component testing. So that way we eliminate the duplication, and then we don't need to recreate the test data or properties in these separate files. So Cypress, what it does is basically it can mount actual Storybook stories, including the decorator themes and whatever the global settings you have, all together as a module. You can actually bring them into Cypress component testing, and then we can mount them. That means our documentation and our tests are basically in perfect sync. And designers see the same story in Storybook that developer test in Cypress. So QA can use those same stories for automated visual validation, and then that becomes a single source of truth for the entire UI test, which are basically reliable, reusable, and consistent. So here, Storybook defines how components look, and Cypress tests how they behave. So basically, together they close the loop between design, development, and testing. So the general question is basically if Storybook already has the interaction test which were recently introduced, then why do we need to use the Cypress? Where does it makes the value? So Storybook interaction testers are great for documenting and verifying the user flows within the Storybook. They use primarily the testing library APIs and typically run in a simulated DOM environment, JS DOM, which is lightweight and perfect for the documentation. But whereas Cypress component testing, on the other hand, runs in a real browser, which gives the full control, including the network stubbing, clock control, and debugging via terminal, and so many other features. So where does Storybook make sense? Storybook is ideal if you want a visual regression with a documentation validation, and whereas Cypress is good for like a QA grade environment interactive testing, and then all like when you already have like a end-to-end testing set up with the Cypress, and then adding this component testing with Storybook would actually add more value. So it's basically they complement each other. So basically we use the Storybook to define the component looks alike, how it's going to look like, and Cypress to validate how it's going to behave in a real conditions, like real states and the properties. So when does Cypress component testing shines? Like when does it actually make impact? So we need to use the Cypress. I mean, it makes more sense when the it makes more sense when we are testing the complex interactions. It could be forms, like a complex forms or onboarding, or like it could be any kind of wizards, a set of wizards or stuff like that. You want to test them as a whole component and then cover all the use cases. Or maybe you have like a models, you have like a model opening up another model, like a scenario where a use case where you have opening a model and then doing some kind of actions. Or maybe you have a keyboard navigation, or you have some kind of complex drag and drop components, or anything beyond the regular static small UI components. Like the more it gets complex in terms of the components, or maybe in terms of the uh, in terms of the UI elements, you have the larger UI elements. That's where the Cypress component testing makes more sense. And also when you need a full environment control, right? So if you want to mock the API calls, you want to stop the timeouts, or maybe you want to simulate the error scenarios, and you want to handle the rate limits, all those things you'll get out of the box with the Cypress, where you have been already made use of them in the Cypress end-to-end test. Also, it is perfect when we want to unify the QA workflow, which is what is basically you already have a Cypress set up for the end-to-end test, and then adding the Cypress component test along with the Storybook, then you are basically having this unified workflow where QA engineers can reuse pretty much all the Cypress commands, and then shared shared elements or shared functions like the support commands and everything can be used. There is nothing new to add here. Also, it also has, like we mentioned, it also gives the rich debugging, snapshots, all those network logs, and then all those console traces, everything all together as part of the Cypress framework. So, like, we'll have a quick look at like how Storybook versus Cypress look in terms of the differences. So, if you go by like generally like these various factors, so Storybook on the left hand side, it basically covers the unit testing and the isolated interaction, but whereas it has the Cypress is like the browser level, which is integration and then the advanced interaction, and then Storybook is more of a preview, and whereas the Cypress runs in a real browser. Also, the it has the it majorly focuses on the design system, visual regression. It also has the accessibility, but whereas Cypress is basically focused on the user flows, API mocking, and then these complex interactions. And then obviously the Storybook, since it is isolated, so it is generally faster. It runs headless, and then it actually available in the Storybook UI. But whereas we might need to in Cypress, we might need to have its own configuration and setup. So these are the major differences between the Storybook and Cypress. But the major key part is basically figuring out what makes sense for the project, like for the projects, for the individual projects, right? So before we understand the before we get into these compose stories, we can also quickly have a look at like what was there earlier. So in the earlier days, Cypress Test also used to use the Storybook, but not as a compose stories, but they used to use iframe. So the approach was basically Cypress Test interacted with the Storybook using its iframe HTML endpoint. Like when generally the Storybook runs in a sandboxed environment, and then Cypress Test to use to launch that URL and then go through the component and try to test as if like the end-to-end test. But the approach is not scalable. I mean, it doesn't work, and it is actually it doesn't it's not as smooth as it's supposed to be. So it is kind of slow, it is brittle, and then it is a cross domain messy. So the Storybook server is separate, and then we need to basically have to do a bunch of things to do a bunch of things before we actually test the component, and it's not as smooth as the current approach, which is compose stories. So what is compose stories and how that actually works? So the compose stories is what actually made that huge improvement where which is allowing us to basically combine this Cypress and Storybook together. So what we can do now, we can import those Storybook stories directly as components without spinning up the Storybook at all. So in this case, you don't need to run the Storybook server at all. So what we're going to do, we're going to, in our Cypress component testing, we're going to import those stories as like any other module, and then we're going to mount the component with those properties, with those states. So the compose stories automatically applies the same arguments, same decorators or globals or any other settings we have used in the Storybook instance. So the rendered component looks exactly same but loads instantly. So basically, there is no iframe overhead, there is no reload delays, there is no flakiness. So that's what this Cypress plus Storybook integration makes like a perfect sync. So how do we make this happen? Like, what are the actual implementation we would need to do to make this work together? So first thing, the setting up Cypress component testing is straightforward. So what we're going to do is basically install the Cypress, and then when we open the runner, and then when we choose the component testing, it automatically detects the framework, and then it actually generates the Cypress config. That is all out of the box today, but we can also do the manual configuration. But it has all those framework related stuff. So in the React, you have Cypress React, and then for Angular you have Cypress Angular, and then both exposes a simple Cypress mount helper to render your component. So from there, we can run commands just like the end-to-end test. We can click the buttons, we can intercept APIs, we can assert DOM elements. We can do pretty much all we do everything in the end-to-end test. We can almost do the same things, and then we can do only isolated component testing, right? So this setup is simpler than than it sees. It's most of like a plug and play. Also, there are libraries we would need to make this work for the individual frameworks, meaning like the integrating the Cypress and Storybook. So we would need to import I mean, we would obviously need a Cypress related libraries, which is Cypress, React, or Angular, or any other framework we choose. And then also we would need the Storybook uh, plugin, which is like a library which basically helps us to connect these compose stories, like connect these Cypress and Storybook together. So we also have like Storybook testing React for the React. Also for the latest version, we have Storybook React Wheat if you are using React Wheat, or if you are using other plugin, they have their own that plugin related library. So in this demo, I'm using React Wheat. Also Angular has a similar libraries. So as we mentioned, so we'll have the consistent Cypress commands across the frameworks, and then we use the storybooks stories for the isolated test. So how can we make this strategy, like how can we make this setup uh, I mean, scale well and then effectively use? So obviously we would need to have basically each storybook story already defines a UI state, right? And then a specific combination of properties, themes, and decorators. So we should not duplicate them. And then obviously we should make use of them with the compose stories. That's the whole point of bringing them together. And then Cypress can import and mount all your stories directly, turning the documentation into executable test fixtures. Also, if a story breaks, only the test fails. So that forces the alignment between your design system and the test coverage. Also, we can batch the test multiple story variants, override arguments, or dynamically test across the dark and light modes, all from a single shared story definition. So that way we can ensure that the UI documentation is equals to the, I mean, it is equivalent to this test storage. So these are like few ideas where we can make sure that we are reusing and then we are scaling the fixtures. Right. And also we can make use of the mock service worker. Basically, we cannot depend on the APIs all the time. So the APIs may not give the exact response all the time, and then we cannot rely on them and build our component testing, right? It's better to use of mock service worker when it is makes sense, and then we can define similar mocking as we do in the end-to-end testing, and then we can simulate pretty much all the responses, all the status codes, right? Also, we can also use this Cypress intercept to control or spy on the network request dynamically during the test runs. Also, so together, combining these things like the mock service worker and then the intercept, that we can have a predictable and isolated test and a unified mock strategy across development and QA. So the another strength of Cypress, which we touched a bit, is basically the consistency. So the same Cypress command which we used across the end-to-end testing, which is basically visit, get, click, or any other Cypress command can also be used in the component testing. And then the same custom commands, which let's say that you have a login form, you're logging in, which you need in your end-to-end test. Also, you need to validate that component testing. So you can filling that login form application could be a common command which you would have already added in the interface. We can easily reuse that same filling the form into the component testing. So we are basically have one source of truth, and then we are not writing. But we can do in the component testing, we can do more variations, which is pretty much what we have in the storybook. All the variation, all the theme, and all the accessibility, everything can be go in detail and dive deeper into the each edge cases in the Cypress component testing. And then we also have these shared practices and common collaboration across end-to-end testing and component testing. So that way it simplifies, and then there is no new learning and new syntax to get to new syntax to understand. So that way the Cypress becomes like a single testing framework from the unit level interactions to the full user journeys. So also, and in addition, if there is already a Cypress Cloud setup, so that this the analytics, it brings all the analytics and the observability to the test, and then it also tracks the component testing in also in the Cypress cloud. So that way, basically, all we can track all the accessibility audits and then flake detection, performance timings across both component and end-to-end test. All test appears in a single unified dashboard. So you can see the coverage, historical pass-fail trends, and then debugging videos and everything side by side. That turns basically the test suite into a living quality dashboard, connecting visual documentation, component test, and end-to-end stability in one place. So far we have seen like how it works. So let's see in a demo application. But before that, I just want to give a preview of what is the demo project looks like, and then what it contains, and then see how we gonna basically implement the Cypress component testing and Storybook together. So I just picked a simple project where we make a flight search, and then we see results, and then we try to make a booking. So in this demo application, I'm just focusing on the two major components, which is the flight search form and then the flight cards, the results card, just to explain the component testing stories, storybook stories, and then the end-to-end test, how these three come together. Right. So this is a search form page, and I also have a results page where we have like a simple flight card, and then we basically try to a user can select any flight card, and then it basically lands into the checkout page, and it has like the standard Tailwind CSS, and then mock service worker, and then I combined Storybook and Cypress. Testing. This is simplified, but a realistic version of a simple booking app, right? And then for this project, I use this setup, which is basically I use React, TypeScript, Vite, and then with the Tailwind, and then Storybook 9 and then Cypress 13 versions I've used, and then obviously the mock service worker to mock the API in the end-to-end test as well as in the component testing. And so the components which are focused is search form and the flight card. Also, the folder structure is basically something looks like this. I have some common components at the root level, which is basically button, like any other, like your drop downs or any other things. And then I have these features, which is now a flight booking. And then I have the components related to the flights, and I have pages related to the home page, a results page, and a checkout page. And then I also have something called mocks, and then a folder called Cypress where I have end-to-end test, and then the component specific configuration and support, which is basically the common commands and everything. So this way we basically understand like this. Basically, this gives some kind of high level structure so that we can follow along the demo. Right. And also there are a couple of configuration I want to highlight. We'll also again look into the code, but I just want to highlight it here so that we know what are the major pieces of this project. So which is basically we used a type module, and then obviously the relevant Cypress config is there, and then which has the Storybook 9 and the Vite builder. And then I used Storybook React Vite in this case to get the compose stories, but in a previous version we would need to use Storybook / testing React as a library to get that compose stories. And then also have some simple accessibility and then accessibility testing included in this project. So yeah, now let's get into the demo. So we'll see. We'll open the. I'll share my project first, and then we'll go through the setup first, and then we'll try to run the actual project where we see the application, and then we'll run the storybook, and then we'll review the stories, and then we'll see what is covered, what are the states covered, and what is the documentation. And then we'll review how we're going to import those stories into the Cypress component testing. And then we'll run the Cypress component testing. And then we'll launch end-to-end testing and then see what is the common shared things and then how it actually works in real demo. So let me quickly share my the other entire desktop just to give a overall picture. Before that, I just want to show you the GitHub of that project. So as you can see, So this is a project. So I just want to again just quickly navigate what it is. So we have, as I mentioned, two components and then two pages, the major components and then two pages, and then this is the architecture or like the folder structure and the tech stack which we just went over, and then a couple of things which are basically we used Storybook, Cypress component, and everything, and then these are the high level commands, right? So commands to run the application, and then the configuration. So let me actually share my entire desktop to run the application entire screen. Now, 1 second, just give me a second. Okay, so okay, so start window and then okay, okay, cool. So let me share my. Or probably I think I would need to share because I need to run multiple applications. Give me a second. Entire screen. Okay, cool. Okay, so probably you see, yeah, entire. Okay, yeah. So this is the project I have in my local, which is basically the same thing which we discussed. I'll start with package.json. We have this run command, but I want to quickly walk through over the packages what we have, React, and then we have these dev dependencies for the storybook, and then all these TypeScript thing, and then Cypress related stuff, and then some of the React Bit thing, right? So let's get into the I think Cypress config, the quick view. So there is we need to have the individual component settings for the end-to-end test and then as well as the component testing, right? So we have all these settings. And a similar way, we'll have the Tailwind settings also, but which is we'll not look into that. So we'll look into the source structure. So we have the common components, which I mentioned, like any low level, bit level components. And then we have these features, which is basically, in this case, I have the flights feature, and then I have these high level pages, which is home page and results page, and the checkout page, and the common components. So the major two components we are looking at is basically the search form component, which is basically the a form which takes the inputs for the travel, like where are you traveling from, like a city route, a destination, and the departure city, and then just like some few generic information, and then when the user submit it, we land to the results, and then we'll get into the checkout. So the results has this major component as the flight card component. So we'll see the view, the application running here basically in the this is the local application running in 5173 port. So this is the search form component. So this is what I'm focusing on to write the storybook stories first, then use them for the Cypress component testing, right? So here I'll just walk you through the simple application first, then we'll get into the storybook stories. So there are like multiple variation. In this case, a user can enter from, to, and then depart, and select all those things like the remaining options, and then can do any of these options, right? So we would need to have a storybook with all those various combinations, and then when the user selects search flights, we'll pretty much show a flight card with again various options. You may have baggages or like a separate variations, a typical UI component variation. Also, I just kept one model just to make sure how Cypress helps us to test these little bit complex than the regular components, right? So there is a model here, and when the user select a flight, we get into the checkout page. So this is the navigation from the a home page, which is basically search page, to the results and then checkout. So this is a simple navigation where a simple application where we may have end-to-end test using the Cypress. That's the usual, right? So and then also now we have these components. We'll look into the storybook. So I'm already running the storybook, which is npm run storybook, which is running at the uh, what is the port, which is basically here. It is running at the 6006, right? So it is running, and then here are the two common components, but we'll focus on the feature components, or like the complex components, which add where the Cypress component testing adds value. Right, let's look at the search form, which is here. So the possible variations are basically we may have some invalid inputs. And then there is like I mean, it has some policy banner. It has only one way selected, a round trip selected, and then multi-city disabled, and then with a pre-filled context. So these are some possible variations of this search form, and we already have some kind of documentation and all the possible variation loaded here in the storybook. So now we have, now let's look at the storybook file for this one. Like, how did we added this thing, right? So this is the sorry, this is a search form which is here. Search form. This is a search form story file where we basically this is a standard storybook import structure, right? So we have a standard storybook way to write, a way to add a way to add the story. So, but the key part is basically these variations. So we have all these variations, meaning like this invalid inputs, and then a component, the search form component with the policy banner, and then one way, and then round trip, or maybe a multi-city. So these are some variations, right? So these are the variations which we gonna make use, like reuse them for the Cypress component testing. In this case, I have the search form component, stories, and Cypress component test all together in one folder, but it's up to individual project and configuration, the structure. So in this case, so I have these stories. So this is where I'm gonna make use of these properties or the states into the Cypress component testing. So let's see the actual component testing with the storybook stories. So this is where I'm basically getting all the stories, which is from the search farm stories, and then I do have this compose stories. So compose stories is where you pass all the stories. This is the key part, where we pass all the stories, and when we import those each variation as the module. So what we can do now, all we can do in a regular component testing, we mount the component. But in this case, what we are doing, we are mounting the a variation, a storybook variation as the component. So what we are doing, this is all standard setup where we do a describe and everything, and then I am just doing some date setup. But if you look at here, we mount the storybook story variation, and once we have that, it basically loads the same component with the particular variation, and then we can do all our testing usual, like as we do in the end-to-end testing. So we select whatever we want, and then whatever the element we want, and then we make sure that here I'm using a common command, which is basically get by test ID, which is which is basically a simple reusable piece of code. Is basically I'm using data cy as the selector, and then I'm just reusing that here. This is also one of the one of the key points is basically we can reuse the same get by test ID in the end-to-end test. Also, what I'm doing here, instead of going through each and every element and then filling the data and then making sure it follows the it works as expected. So we have this common again as support a common support command, which is basically flow submit search. This also does the same thing, right? So flow submit search is basically is a common command written basically. I'm just trying to find the yeah here. So what it does is basically finds the search button and then it clicks. Similar way, we have this shared commands, Cypress command, which is flow open fair details, and then also flow fill the search form. So we're gonna make use of those common commands across Cypress component testing as well as the end-to-end testing. So let me quickly, I mean, it's the same thing again for all the other tests. So we mount it, we do any testing, and if there is any common things, we basically do like entering the details and then make sure it follows the it works as the expected, meaning it has the error alerts are there, or maybe it has the all the data fill in and everything. So similar way, we have test component testing for each and every variation, which is basically invalid inputs here, and then the banner here, corporate policy banner, and then round trip, and multi-city and pre-filled. So each and every variation in the storybook has its own component testing, which is automatically we got it for free basically. So let me now quickly run Cypress component at this context. Run cy open, right, and then we'll see how does it look like. So we go to component testing, right? And then I'm just selecting Chrome here. Okay, so now you see a Cypress runner, and then I'm selecting search form. Let's see how it does test. So I have similar those test cases. So yeah, here you see the basically it went over through uh, all the variations, right? So it made sure that errors are there. Let's say here in this case, it made sure that the policy banner is there, and similar way all other variation. It made sure that multi-city is there, and like similar way, right? So this way, so now we have all these. If we compare side by side, so we have the similar variation what we have in the storybook, and we are now testing in the component testing with the real browser and with the real variations. Okay, so similar way, I have another component which is pretty much same, which is basically flight card here. So flight card here, and which has the different variations with the baggage and all those stuff, and like all the variations, right? And also we have this fares details. Now we'll see how we're gonna do the same thing with the Cypress component testing, like how it's gonna look like in the component testing. Let me bring that back. Okay, here, right? So let's go back to the specs, and then we have this flight card. Let's run this flight card now. Um, Okay, so here if you see it, it makes sure that it made sure that it rendered the basic info, and then we are also testing the fare card model. So in this case, we render the fare card and then we clicked on it. So it made sure that it rendered the fare model, and then it basically finished the test. And also we have this some dynamic badges and everything. But the key part is basically we pretty much again reuse the storybook to make sure that it actually covers all the use cases in the Cypress component testing, right? So those are Cypress component testing. So now we'll quickly. So we have the component testing, and then now let's look at the end-to-end testing, right? So let me, so now we have this component testing. Let me actually now navigate to the end-to-end testing. Okay, so here we have these pages, right? 3 pages, and then uh, here I have these end-to-end testing. So which is basically a search from, it basically what it's going to do is basically the same thing what we did in the demo. I'm like in the initial application where we enter some data, and then click on search files, search flights, and then get into the results card, and then make sure we landed into the checkout. So let me just quickly navigate through the end-to-end testing, Cypress end-to-end testing file. So what we have is basically some before each, basically we wanted to make sure the date, and then we are stubbing the search flight, the search flights, which basically, let me also show you the stubbing part here. Search flights, right? So we have this, basically there's the API call when the user click on search flights. We want to just mock it out and then pass some results, which is the fixtures. So we can also reuse the fixtures in this case. So here are the fixtures, right? So we get the flights. We Let me wait. I think I open 1 second. Yeah, here. So this is the end-to-end test file. So we mock the search flights API call, and then we are giving flights and also wrapping first flight just to select. So and then we launch the page, right? So we visit the home page, and then we are again, see here in this case we are using the flow fill search form, which we also used in the search form which we also used in the search from component testing. So this is the common command, Cypress command, which we used across. Similar way, we have this flow submit search button, and then we used pretty much all in the component testing. So we did the submit, and then we made sure that it lands the results page. And then we also have the search. We are waiting for the search flight CPI response, and then we make sure the flight card is displayed, and then we click on the select button, and then make sure we are landing into the checkout page, and then making sure some of the checkout page renders properly, all the data, and then we click on the book button, or like the book button is allowed to click. But the key pieces here is basically we have these common commands across, and then it's the same thing, same structure and same syntax across the end-to-end test here and component testing here. So now let me quickly run the end-to-end test. So again, it's the same command, but we need to pick the end-to-end test in this case. So we'll take end-to-end testing uh, and then launch the Cypress browser, testing browser, and then we have this search end-to-end testing. Yeah, it is done basically. But yeah, so what we are doing again, same thing, right? So we come here and then we enter all the data, and then we make sure we landed into the results page. And then once we are done, we select the button, and then we make sure the checkout page renders with the all the relevant data, right? So yeah, so this is the the end-to-end test flow. So we have everything in one place, and then obviously if we have the cloud and everything, we have basically we can do all the tracking in one place. But the key part is basically we effectively utilize the storybook stories, right? So yeah, so let me go back to the okay, go back to the slides. Okay, cool. So one second. One second. Slide. Okay, cool. So yeah, let me share back quickly. Okay. So yeah, so that's the demo, and then yeah, here is my contact, and then I'm opening up the stage for the Q&A.
Thank you, Raju. That was a outstanding session. I think everyone here can appreciate how powerful it is to bridge design and testing workflows, especially when that means shipping fewer bugs. So I do think we have time at least for a question or two. So I'm going to bring the first one up on screen. How do you balance component and end-to-end testing since many UI cases can be handled by Cypress component test? Any good examples?
Yeah, I think so the end-to-end test, I don't think we can test all the edge cases, right? So the key part is basically end-to-end test, make sure that you have the user flow works from like make sure that the happy path or the major use cases where like the user journey is covered. But whereas the component testing can go all the corners of the flow, right? All the corners of the components. It can make sure the validation work, it can make sure all the edge cases covered, and it can make sure all the possible use cases, like the edge cases which we may not be able to cover, and then which may not be add values to test in the end-to-end test. We cannot afford to have end-to-end tests go by each and every step, right? We cannot have, like, let's say that there is a set onboarding wizard, right? So a user may select some optional fields and may not select some select the optional fields. So in those cases, like let's say that there is a onboarding wizard, and then we have some fields which are not important, which are not mandatory. So what we do in the end-to-end test, we make sure that the happy path works, meaning the required fields are selected, and then it basically moved into your next screen. But whereas in component testing, what we can do, we can also get into those optional areas or get into those edge cases, and then test everything and keep it in component test. And then so that way we are not basically wasting the end-to-end test, but we are actually at the same time covering in the component test. Basically the balance is to make sure the happy path works in end-to-end test, and all the edge cases and all possible cases covered in component test.